Hello, this is Paolo, and welcome to the Blender Survival Guide, episode 10. Just after I published episode 9, the feedback that I received from many of you was all centered around how do I change the keyframes, how do I edit keyframes, and so on. It makes perfect sense since a lot of you are using After Effects or other motion graphics programs. You're used to that activity. You edit keyframes all the time. So I thought it's perfect time now to show how we do that task, how we edit the keyframes inside Blender, because Blender has amazing tools for animation. It's really, really great. But the approach is different, as usual. This is Blender, so it's different. Nothing hard. You just have to know where to look and what to look for. So I'm going to start and create a quick animation. It's going to be a terrible animation. The quality of the animation is not the point. What it illustrates is important. So let's start as usual. Deselect everything, right click on the cube and delete the cube, X. There you go. For this animation, I'm going to use a special model that is available in the Blender toolbox. Let's press Shift A, go to Mesh, and click on Monkey. Monkey is basically this monkey head called Suzanne. It's the mascot of Blender. And let's position Suzanne in the right point. I'm going to bring this up, and then I'm going to rotate it so it's like it's staying on the floor. And then we want to lower it, adjust a little bit, lower some more. Now here's a nice little trick. When you move objects, you can use the manipulator, and many times the increment can be eyeballed, but sometimes you just want some extra precision. And so when you are moving things, like if I'm clicking on the manipulator in this window and I'm judging the position in this other window, sometimes the scale between these two windows, the ratio, is making this work hard. So there is a quick tip. If you press Shift while moving the object, the Shift basically increases your resolution of the movement, so you can really go by fine increments, and the Shift works in all situations. If I press R right now and I want to rotate the object, then I can press Shift and start moving the mouse, and I have very small increments, even though I'm moving the mouse quite a bit. So precision editing with Shift. All right. So now we have our object position right, and I have my timeline here. First of all, let's create a keyframe for the original position. So I press I, and I select lock route. I'm going to go a little faster now because we've seen this a few times already. Okay, so here in the timeline, I'm going to press T and select seconds, and I'm going to move at 2 seconds ahead. Okay, and we can see our keyframe right here. And at 2 seconds, I'm going to just move Suzanne ahead a little bit, and I'm looking at the camera in this angle, and I like to have the subject positioned more toward the camera, so I'm going to rotate. So I press R from the top view and click. And again, I'm going to press I lock route. So now we have our little travel path here. Okay. So then I move another 2 seconds ahead. And let's say we're going to move this this way and this way. I'm going to turn a little bit like this. I lock route. Okay. And then we're going to move another 2 seconds ahead, come back this way, rotate over the camera, and I lock route. And then at the very last keyframe at position 8 seconds, I'm going to try to kind of put the subject back where it was, I'd like to have like a looping animation. That would be nice. So, of course, I can try to eyeball it, but see, I didn't change my cursor here. The cursor is still in the original position. So one thing we can do is to use snapping. So snapping works like this. You selected your object, you press Shift S for snap. And here we can say that you want to snap the selection to the cursor, which will basically take Suzanne and send her right where the cursor is. Boom. Done. Okay, there are a couple of issues. I mean, this is a great technique and you can use it many other times, but in this case, it's not going to work. And let's create a keyframe so we can see exactly why not. I want to create a looping animation. So right now, if you look at the position of the monkey head, well, it's below the horizon, below the floor. So if I go to my original keyframe and I press Shift down arrow, now if I press Shift up arrow, I go at the end of the animation, and we see that this is not going to loop. Okay. So if we were in After Effects, the solution would be very simple. We would just take the first keyframe and copy it, and then go to the end of our animation and paste in there. But Blender uses a different approach. Of course, this is Blender. So the approach is basically in Blender, the interface, the user interface, tries to use the same exact mechanism every time. So for example, if you are using the G key to grab an object and move it, then every operation that is involved in moving something, moving keyframes or moving objects, the same deal. It will use the G key. So how can we do that in our timeline since we have our keyframes here? Well, the secret of the timeline is that the timeline is just for playback. It's not for editing of the keyframes. The timeline is involved with controlling the playback. Couple of examples. Let me show you here. If we go to the end of our animation, even though the position of the subject is wrong, it doesn't matter right now, we see that this is at the 8th second. Now, if you notice, let me grab it with a middle click and scroll to the left, you see that there is a darker gray area here. This area here is basically where the animation ends. So this is the point where it ends. There is no more playback from this point on. And in fact, if we go to our scene parameters, we see that our animation, as usual, ends at frame 250. Now, we are showing this in seconds, so things are a little bit different. Now, let me show you one thing. Let's say that I'm done with my animation and I say, okay, from this point on, I want to just loop it from the beginning. So one thing I could do is to switch with the T to seconds, take note of the frame here, and then enter the frame in this field. Well, there is a much, much easier way of doing that. And when I have the cursor here positioned at the end, I just press E for end. And now my animation has been trimmed. And in fact, we see that right now in this field has been converted to 192. So here I can use the convenient notation in seconds, and this gets converted automatically by Blender. So you press E, and if you want to extend it, for example, you want to add another half minute here, half second, what I'm saying. So you move it to 8.5 and press E, and it gets extended. Similarly, if you are thinking about rendering just a subset of frames and you want to create a chunk that only starts from second 6 up to 8.5, then you can press S, and Blender will trim the animation from 6 to 8.5, which corresponds to frame 144 to frame 204. very, very convenient. So that's what the timeline is concerned about. The timeline is for controlling the playback of your animation. So I pressed S again to reset the starting point. Another thing that you can do with the timeline, for example, is to create markers. Markers are created with the M key. How incredibly counterintuitive. M, and it creates a little marker there. And now I can go to 4 and I can create another marker, and 6 and I can create another marker. And now I can move from marker to marker by simply using page up and page down. So if I press page down, I'll go to my previous marker. And again, if I press page up, I'll go to my next marker. Also, with the marker now highlighted, see here? I can right-click on each marker. Again, right-click is the same thing. You learn it once, and you learn it forever. So I can right-click on this marker, and I can press G to move it. Again, well, let's press ESC for now. So the same logic, Blender's user interface might be baffling at first, but it is extremely consistent. Now, if I want to assign a label to my marker, I can do that. I can just press Control M, and I can enter a name. So let's say I want to create a pause at this point here. Great. Let's create the pause. Enter just the label. So I know that at some point I will have to go to this point and create kind of a hold frame or something like that. So I can go to my next marker here. Okay. I can right-click on this marker and Control M, say, okay, I'm going to have an explosion at this point. Okay. So now we can go from marker to marker. And when I snap to this marker, you can see in the window, in the camera window, I can see the object that is being the subject of my snapping right now and the marker. Isn't that interesting? See the color, how it changes as soon as you hit the frame with a keyframe and the marker. Pretty neat. This is very, 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 very useful. And see how if I press A to deselect everything. Now if I go and press page up, for example, see how the explosion marker now is moved up a little bit. So Blender gives us the kind of feedback. All right. So this is basically what the timeline window does. Okay, so at this point, let's see how we do what we plan to do. So to create a looping animation and edit the keyframes. Now, there are two other windows that are involved in the creation of keyframes and manipulation of keyframes. One, you might have seen it before, it's called the Ipo Curve Editor. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping here. So right-click, split area, middle-click, change the splitting direction, and let's move things around. It's going to be a little crowded, but hey, that's okay. So now in this other window we just created, let's switch to the Ipo Curve Editor. Ooh, interesting thing there. Now the IPO is called, or Ipo, stands for interpolation, because this is basically what you see in After Effects when you call the curve editor. Now, Blender being developed by very, very smart geeks, sometimes gets the name a little technical. And in this case, because these are technically interpolation curves, that's what this window received as a name. Not really the best nickname. And all this stuff is going to be completely changed in the next version of Blender. As far as reorganization of the windows, the principle stays more or less. But this is all important material that we learn at this point. So the interpolation window shows us the curves of each parameter. So in this case, we see our location x, y, and z, and our rotation x, y, and z. Now I can isolate, for example, each curve if I want to edit it in a more controlled way. So I can click on rotation z, and now I can see only that curve. And again, see that we have our markers here. So I can hit the markers in the IPO window and be assured that I'll be working on the right spot. Now, the IPO window works very well for things like changing the parameters of the curve. And again, consistency is Blender's forte here. How did I change the curve from just showing it to being able to edit it? You press tab, no more no less than when you edit the model. So in this case, I press tab, all the nodes are selected, so I can press A to deselect. And for example, when I get to this point of my animation, I can right click on this node and press G, and now I can basically change my rotation angle. If I click on here, you can see that Suzanne has changed rotation. So let's try again. Take a look at here at the model. I press G, Y, and then I go way down. Now you see you can change the parameter here, but sometimes you don't need to change the parameter. You need to change where the keyframe falls for timing. So one of the things you could do is to shift click on all these parameters and try to select them all at the same time and move them left and right. There is a much easier way of doing this. So remember, the Ipo window is perfect to manipulate the single parameters, but when you want to edit an entire keyframe, follow me. And we are going to split again, middle click, split, and we are going to call another window, in this case the NLA, or Non-Linear Animation Editor. And I know that a lot of you are now going to have a fuzzy warm feeling because this looks remarkably like After Effects. And yes, welcome home. We are in fact in keyframe territory. Keep in mind that right now all the keyframes are selected, so whatever you do is going to apply to all keyframes. So press A to deselect it, and now you can right click on each keyframe and do all the damage that you want. So let's start with the first task. That was, let's create a looping animation. This is my last keyframe. This is my beginning keyframe. I want them to be the same. So I'm going to create a marker here just to be sure that I can find that spot again. It's really not necessary now, but you know that in a real animation you will need to do that. So press M. We don't need to name it. We know exactly what it is. So what I'm going to do here is to have this keyframe selected, and I'm going to press X to delete it. And it's gone. So now I'm going to go to my beginning of my animation. And before I continue, I want to snap my movements to the next frame. So at frame step. So I right click on this keyframe. And how do we duplicate something in Blender? Shift D. So I press Shift D and I start moving. And now see that little rubber band that is extending. Basically what Blender is telling me at this point is that the original keyframe and the keyframe that I'm positioning now are the same. So this span that is visualized by the rubber band is basically a hold keyframe. And I continue to move it to the right, and see what's happening when I cross the second keyframe. Bam! the link is broken because, of course, from this point on, the second keyframe is dictating the position. So my keyframe right now is different from the previous one. So I continue until I get to this point. And now my animation has exactly the same beginning and end. Let's see if this works. So let's go to the beginning in Alt-A. There you go. And there it ends and continues. And exactly a perfectly loopable animation. It's not work of art, but we have learned how to do it. Okay, press ESC. Now, there is a very, very, very interesting little add-on that is available in Blender when you need to judge where some objects will be in the animation. Let's say, just for the sake of the discussion, that I want to place some objects in the scene, and I could go with my animation control here and see where each point of the animation brings the subject, but there is an interesting little trick. In the 3D view, if I press K, I see some ghost images of the keyframes, and this is where Suzanne is going to hit the marks every time. Isn't that interesting? Now, I can use this, for example, if I needed to place, I don't know, a pillar or any kind of other object between these two positions. I can just visualize, move my 3D cursor there, and then press Shift-A and place a cylinder. I can just use 16 vertices, press OK, and now the cylinder is visible. Where did the ghosts go? Well, the cylinder is the highlighted element right now, so there are no additional keyframes for that object. So that's what happened. Okay, let's move the cylinder up, and we can scale it on the Z-axis and move it up again. Okay, is it really on the floor? We can press G, Z, and with the Shift key, just move it very carefully. Okay, so now I know that that cylinder will be right there in the right spot. Of course, it can be also in the trajectory. So, you know, it will not look really good. So let's do this. But at least we have a very, very useful tool to position objects without having to go and scroll every step of the animation. And you can use it for many other situations. Okay, so now let's see how we do that pause, that hold keyframe that we were talking about at the beginning. So I'm looking at the animation. I played a little bit, and I see that actually the pause should happen at this point and not at this point. This point, the subject is already gone. I like to hit the mark here and hold for, I don't know, maybe half a second, and then move to the next stage. Okay, and possibly correct this orientation. I like the monkey head to look at our direction. So let's see how we can do that. That's a good example. All right, we can just move to our marker right here, and we right click on this keyframe, and we press Shift D, and we move forward. It's a 50, 60 frames, and let's see at this point. Okay, so now we have our hold keyframe, and then Suzanne starts moving again. Okay, let's see how that works. Boom, that's the marker, pause. Okay, good. Now let's fix this other problem and go to the next keyframe, actually to the next marker if we want, but it's the same because we have the snapping at the frame step. So as we hit this point, we're at the right placement, and I'm gonna just right click on Suzanne at this point, remove the ghosts, and press R to rotate. Okay, and maybe I might want to move this a little bit, like this and this. Okay, and I press I, lock route, which will basically replace the keyframe with the new value. Okay, and let's see if that really works. Okay, and so there is a little rotation. Okay, and then continues to the other point. All right, yep, and continues. Good. All right, so I think we have covered a few important points here. Let me recap. We've seen our timeline with our beginning and end of the animation using the S and E key. We have seen markers. We've seen how to rename the markers. We've seen how to snap to the frame. We saw how to do editing of single parameters in the Ipo window, and how to retime our animation using the NLA editor. So all these are 3 different windows. You can rearrange your workspace in the way you prefer, but now you know when to use each window. So till next time, my name is Paolo Ciccone of Pret A 3D, 3D Ready to Wear. Happy blendering.